There comes a moment in your life when you stop bowing to intimidation, when the shaking in your voice turns into iron in your spine, when the person who once controlled your emotions suddenly realizes they no longer own you. And that moment, that exact moment, is when the narcissist feels something they have never felt before in your presence: powerlessness. See, they never needed your love. They never needed your loyalty. They never needed your kindness. What they needed was your fear, your hesitation, your silence, your shrinking spirit, because your fear was the food that kept their ego alive. But when you rise, when you stand unbothered, unshaken, unmoved, you take something from them they don't know how to replace: control. And without control, their entire performance collapses. The mask starts to crack. The voice gets louder, the lies get heavier, and the desperation slips through their arrogance like a leak in a sinking ship. When you show no fear, you expose the weakness they work so hard to hide. You strip away the costume, the performance, the illusion of power they built over your life like a prison. Suddenly, they don't know how to speak without intimidation. They don't know how to stand without manipulation. They don't know how to exist without someone sacrificing their peace to feed their ego. Fear was the leash, and you just cut it. So now they panic, they scramble, they smear your name because they can no longer bend your spirit. They gather an audience because they can no longer gather your submission. They try to destroy your image because they failed to destroy your identity, and that terrifies them. What they fear most is not losing you. It's losing the version of you they thought they controlled, the silent one, the apologetic one, the emotionally chained one. Once you rise above fear, you become a mirror they cannot stand to look into. Because you don't just threaten their narrative, you threaten their illusion. You're not the same anymore. You don't flinch when they raise their voice. You don't fold when they withhold affection. You don't crumble when they withdraw attention. You have become what they cannot manipulate, a person who sees the truth, and there is nothing more dangerous to a narcissist than someone who is no longer blind, no longer afraid, and no longer available to be controlled. So stand tall, stand firm, because the moment you stop fearing them, they lose the only weapon they ever had. Your courage is their collapse, your strength is their unmasking, and your freedom is the end of their illusion. When you show no fear to a narcissist, their illusion of superiority begins to collapse from the inside because their entire identity is held together by the belief that they are above you, smarter than you, more powerful than you, and entitled to authority over your emotions. They walk through life thinking they are untouchable, as if everyone around them is simply a supporting character in the movie of their ego. And for a long time that fantasy works because people remain silent, cautious, intimidated, or emotionally compliant. Fear feeds the illusion. Your uncertainty keeps the illusion alive. The hesitation in your voice is what convinces them they are in control. But when you no longer react with fear, when you no longer shrink in their presence, you rip away the psychological scaffolding holding up their false image of superiority. You don't just defy them, you expose them. Not with words, not with confrontation, and not with a public battle, but by simply refusing to be emotionally beneath them anymore. That is the first real fracture in their armor. Narcissists survive off hierarchy. So they must always feel above. They need a sense of elevation even if it's imaginary, because internally they feel deeply inferior. So superiority becomes a shield, but that shield only works if you accept the role of lesser. Once you stop playing that role, their superiority is no longer a fact. It is only a story they are telling themselves, and suddenly the story looks flimsy, childish, and desperate. They start to see that you're not impressed by them anymore. You're not intimidated by the emotional threats they used to weaponize. You're not seeking their approval, and once admiration, fear, dependency, or submission disappear, their ego loses oxygen, the illusion suffocates. This is why narcissists become angry when you are confident, centered, and unaffected. Your calmness is confrontation without aggression. Your stillness is defiance without chaos. Your emotional detachment is evidence that their psychological spell has broken. They realize you are no longer living inside the world they built. You stepped out of it, and the moment you step out, they feel small inside the world they tried to rule. That collapse is internal long before it ever becomes visible externally. They feel it in their posture, in their tone slipping, in their forced arrogance turning more theatrical than natural. Suddenly, they are not performing confidence. They are fighting not to look weak. The superiority illusion works only when you fear losing them, when you fear disappointing them, when you fear their reaction, or when you fear standing alone. Once that fear disappears, they are no longer a force. They are just a person with a costume, and nothing humiliates a narcissist more than realizing their power was never real, only borrowed from your belief in it. That is why they crack when you stop fearing them. You are not just breaking their control, you are breaking their identity. They built their entire sense of self on the illusion that they tower over you. And when you show no fear, you don't just refuse to bow. You force them to stand on level ground, and once they are no longer above, they are confronted with the truth that they were never higher to begin with. When you show no fear to a narcissist, the loss of emotional control makes them spiral because their power was never rooted in logic, respect, or authority. It was rooted in the emotional grip they had over you. They never owned your life. They owned your reactions. They fed on the anxiety they could provoke, the confusion they could create, the guilt they could plant, and the insecurity they could trigger at will. To a narcissist, control is not about leadership, it is about emotional puppeteering. As long as they could manipulate your internal state, they believed they had dominance over you, and that dominance is the source of their ego's stability. But when you no longer respond with fear, doubt, or emotional collapse, it sends a shock through their system because they can no longer read you, move you, or bend you. That loss of grip is the beginning of their downfall because they are not equipped to function without emotional leverage. They do not know how to interact with people respectfully. They only know how to dominate them. They do not know how to build connection through love, so they build it through fear. They do not know how to inspire loyalty genuinely. So they harvest it through psychological dependency, but once you take away the fear they once depended on, they suddenly have to operate from a level of emotional maturity they never developed. That is when panic appears. Not always on the surface, but behind the mask. The voice gets sharper, the temper gets shorter. They start over-explaining or arguing harder because they feel the loss of control like a drowning man feels the absence of air. Fear was their oxygen. You cutting it off suffocates them slowly. They feel this loss before they even admit it to themselves. They sense that they can no longer predict your next move, and unpredictability terrifies them more than confrontation. As long as they knew how you would respond, they believed they had the upper hand. When your silence is no longer submission but self-possession, when your calm is no longer fear but inner strength, when you don't emotionally react but simply observe, they don't know what to do with that. Their tools stop working. Their usual tricks fail. Their manipulation loops glitch because you are no longer emotionally programmable. They begin to spin, trying a harsher tone, a guilt tactic, passive aggression, sudden affection, fake concern, anything that might reopen the emotional access they once had. But nothing works when fear is gone. You cannot hook someone who is no longer bait, and once the narcissist realizes they can no longer hook you, the spiral intensifies because they are forced into a psychological identity crisis. Who are they if they are not the one in control? Who are they if you no longer kneel to their emotional intimidation? Who are they if your confidence is stronger than their threats? They lose emotional control of you first, and then they slowly lose emotional control of themselves. You strip away the audience they perform dominance for. You strip away the emotional climate they used to feed on. The mask slips not because you attacked them, but because their ego collapsed when there was nothing left to sustain it. And this is when their frustration turns into desperation, because they are not just losing control over you, they are losing the only version of themselves that ever made them feel powerful. When you show no fear to a narcissist, they shift from manipulation to panic because they realize their psychological tricks no longer land the way they used to. At first, they will continue using their normal tactics: gaslighting, intimidation, silent treatment, guilt induction, emotional baiting, believing that eventually one of them will reactivate your fear response. But when every tactic fails, when every attempt to hook your emotions falls flat, they move from strategic control into emotional chaos. Narcissists do not panic because they care about losing you. They panic because they can no longer program you. Their manipulation was never about connection. It was about conditioning. If they could shape how you thought, they could control how you behaved. But once your mind detaches from their influence, your freedom becomes a threat to their identity. They aren't simply losing a person. They are losing their role as the puppeteer. That shift hits them like psychological collapse because their ego is built on dominance, not reciprocity. The panic appears in subtle ways. First, they begin scrambling for a new method of leverage. One moment they are cold and dismissive, trying to punish you into submission. Then when that fails, they suddenly switch to affection, compliments, or fake remorse, hoping emotional softness will open the door that intimidation couldn't. When that also fails, their panic rises because they are left with no predictable route back into your psychological space. They are not used to earning trust. They are used to psychologically extracting control. When the extraction stops working, they are confronted with the emptiness underneath their manipulation. Their identity depended on your reaction. Once you stop reacting, their sense of self begins to unravel. Panic is not the emotion itself. It is the ego's fear of exposure. Without your compliance, they seem smaller. Without your emotional responsiveness, they feel invisible. Without your fear, their power evaporates. What terrifies a narcissist is not being ignored. It is being seen correctly. They survive off illusion. So when you deny them fear, you deny them illusion. Now they are left with themselves unmasked, uncredentialed, unimpressive, stripped of the psychological stage they used to stand on. When you show no fear, you stop playing your assigned role in their script. You are no longer the inferior character whose weakness justifies their superiority. Now you are simply another human being standing eye level with them, and leveling the ground beneath a narcissist is equivalent to psychological war in their mind. This is why they suddenly escalate their behavior. Not because they are strong, but because they feel themselves losing the only form of power they understand. When manipulation doesn't work, they don't know how to engage like a normal person. They can't reason with you. They can't empathize with you. They can't relate to you. So, they default to panic disguised as aggression or desperation. They will lash out louder because their ego is collapsing quietly. They will smear you to others because they can no longer control you privately. They will try to create confusion externally because they can no longer create weakness internally. This shift from manipulation to panic exposes their dependency on your fear more clearly than anything they ever said or did. You were never the fragile one they were. Your fear made them appear powerful. Your courage reveals how powerless they truly were all along. When you show no fear to a narcissist, they feel powerless for the first time because the only thing that ever made them feel dominant over you was the belief that they controlled your emotional state. They never actually controlled your life, your choices, your mind, or your destiny. They controlled the emotional leash you didn't realize was around your neck. A narcissist doesn't measure their worth by who they are. They measure it by who they can dominate. They don't chase connection, they chase control. They don't seek respect, they seek psychological submission. So when your fear disappears, their entire internal ranking system collapses. Because in their world, if they are not above you, then they are nothing. There is no equal ground in the narcissistic mind. They must feel bigger to feel secure. They must feel superior to feel alive. They must feel warped to feel relevant. The moment you no longer feed those illusions, a void opens up inside them that they cannot fill with anything real. Powerlessness is unfamiliar territory to a narcissist. They have spent their whole life building false power through intimidation, manipulation, entitlement, and psychological pressure. They believe control is proof of worth, so losing control feels like erasure. It feels like they vanish because their identity never developed from authenticity, only performance. They don't know who they are without someone to stand over. They don't know how to define themselves without someone to belittle. Their ego is parasitic. It must feed on someone else's insecurity to maintain its sense of greatness. When you stop being a host for their insecurity, they are no longer inflated by your vulnerability. You unplug them from the emotional source that kept them feeling superior. That is why they hate your confidence, your detachment, your silence, your lack of fear. These things don't just show strength, they show independence. And independence is the most threatening thing in the world to a narcissist. Because independence means they are no longer needed, no longer feared, no longer relevant, no longer powerful. You become someone they cannot rewrite, cannot intimidate, cannot shrink. You become someone who sees them without being controlled by what you see. That is when their ego begins to decay from the inside out. Powerlessness feels like exposure. It feels like being unmasked. It feels like being reduced to the very smallness they have always been secretly running from. A narcissist cannot survive emotionally without dominance. So when you remove fear, you remove dominance. And when you remove dominance, you remove the illusion of who they pretend to be. And this is when the internal panic intensifies, not because you hurt them, but because you revealed how weak they always were beneath the performance. A person who truly has power does not require fear to hold it. A person who truly has security does not need obedience to feel stable. A person who truly has confidence does not need control to feel valuable. Only the fragile demand psychological submission from others to feel strong. Only the insecure require an audience to feel important. Only the powerless need someone beneath them to feel elevated. The moment you rise out of fear, you break the emotional ladder they stood on, and they fall into their true size, their true emptiness, their true internal weakness. That is why they lash out, not in strength, but in panic. You took nothing physical from them. You took the illusion that made them feel larger than life, and without that illusion, they realized they were never larger at all. When you show no fear to a narcissist, they attempt character assassination and smear you because they can no longer control you directly. So they try to control how others see you. The smear campaign is not about truth, morality, or justice. It is about revenge for losing psychological power. A narcissist does not know how to accept defeat with dignity. They only know how to rewrite reality until they look like the hero or the victim. When their manipulation no longer works on you personally, they target your image publicly. They cannot handle the idea that you walked away mentally stronger or emotionally untouchable. So, they attack your reputation in hopes of regaining the superiority you took back from them. If they can't own your mind anymore, they will try to own the narrative. If they can't control your emotions, they will try to control public perception. Because power to a narcissist is not about truth, it is about illusion. The smear campaign begins with subtle poisoning of other people's minds. They spread half-truths, exaggerated stories, twisted emotional versions of events, or completely fabricated accusations. They frame you as unstable, disloyal, cruel, ungrateful, manipulative, or the villain, because in their world there is only one script. If they are not the victorious one, they must become the victim. They need allies not because they care about connection, but because they need witnesses to validate the false identity they are trying to preserve. They cannot tolerate the thought that someone might see the truth, so they rush to rewrite the story before honesty has time to surface. This is psychological damage control disguised as moral outrage. But the deeper reason behind the smear campaign is emotional retaliation. When you no longer fear them, they feel humiliated, not publicly at first, internally. Your independence shatters the ego identity they built around your submission. So to compensate for the internal collapse, they seek external validation. They are trying to recover a sense of power in the eyes of others because they no longer feel powerful in yours. Smearing you is their way of undoing the loss of control. If they can't dominate your spirit anymore, they will attempt to dominate your name. This is the same dynamic as a child who breaks a toy they cannot own. If they cannot possess it, they must destroy it. To them, your dignity is the toy they are trying to break. To a narcissist doesn't smear you because you did something wrong. They smear you because you reclaimed something they thought belonged to them, your sense of self. They are not fighting you. They are fighting the reality that you see through them. They aren't defending their reputation from lies. They are defending their ego from truth. The smear campaign is nothing more than the final attempt at control through fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing support, fear of being isolated. But once you no longer fear their judgment, their weapon turns into noise. What once felt like a threat begins to feel like confirmation. Your strength is showing, and they are reacting to it. And this is the part they never want anyone to see. A smear campaign is not born from power, but from panic. It is not born from righteousness, but from insecurity. It is not born from justice, but from desperation. They try to destroy your name because they already lost access to your soul. They try to turn others against you because they already lost their grip on you. They try to bury your truth in lies because your truth is the one thing their ego cannot survive. When you show no fear to a narcissist, they are forced to confront themselves because your strength becomes a mirror that reflects everything they have spent their life running from. Narcissists are not afraid of you. They are afraid of exposure. They are afraid of the moment someone finally sees through the act, sees behind the mask, sees the emptiness they hide beneath their arrogance. Most people continue feeding their delusion because they fear conflict or crave validation. But when you stop feeding the illusion, when you stand firm in yourself and refuse to bow to intimidation, you accidentally force them to face something far more terrifying than losing control of you. Facing the truth about themselves, you strip away the psychological escape route they use to avoid self-reflection. They can no longer say you're the problem because you are no longer reacting. They can no longer shift blame because you give them no emotional chaos to hide behind. You take away their excuse, and without an excuse, they are left alone with who they truly are. A narcissist builds their identity from the outside in. Instead of developing a self, they borrow one. They construct an image carefully curated and endlessly maintained. They market a persona with precision, shaping every gesture, word, and expression to fit the version of themselves they want the world to adore or fear. Their entire sense of worth exists in a fragile ecosystem of fantasy, projection, and performance. It's not rooted in authenticity, but in perception, a mirror they must constantly polish to ensure their reflection never reveals the cracks beneath. Their existence depends on validation, admiration, and control. Without these, their identity begins to disintegrate. But fantasy only works as long as someone believes in it. The illusion thrives on witnesses, on your attention, your reactions, your emotional investment. The moment you see clearly, the moment you stop feeding the performance, the entire illusion collapses. And when it collapses, it doesn't just crumble for you, it implodes within them. They are suddenly confronted by the emptiness they've spent a lifetime disguising. They feel naked without control, exposed without your submission, irrelevant without your fear reflecting their power back to them. What they once disguised as superiority now reveals itself as fragility. In that exposure, they face a terrifying possibility that they are not the genius they pretend to be, not the visionary they portray, not the extraordinary being they insist upon. They are in truth ordinary, insecure, and perpetually compensating for an internal void they can't fill. Every boast was a shield, every manipulation, a survival tactic, every display of confidence, a desperate plea to believe their own lie. Beneath the arrogance lies a terrified child, still begging to be seen as worthy, still trying to outrun shame and insignificance. And that is the truth narcissists cannot handle. It's not rejection that destroys them, it's revelation. It's not distance that wounds them, it's exposure. When the mask slips and their reflection is no longer admired, but analyzed, they experience a collapse of self, a psychological implosion that feels like death. To them, being seen for who they truly are is the ultimate annihilation. Because their identity was never built from truth, only from illusion, their greatest fear then is not being left. They can always find someone new to manipulate, another audience to deceive, another mirror to polish. What they cannot bear is being seen, truly, deeply seen, without the armor of charm, manipulation, and control. To be seen means to be known, and to be known means their performance ends. That is the moment the spotlight fades. The applause dies, and they are left standing alone, not as the grandiose figure they imagined, but as a deeply insecure, ordinary human being who has spent their entire life pretending to be something more. So, when you show no fear, they begin to wrestle with a reality they spent years avoiding. Their ego was built as a wall to protect them from their own inadequacy, but you standing strong cracks that wall. You force an identity fracture they do not know how to repair. They cannot hide behind arrogance when you are unmoved by it. They cannot use intimidation as a shield when you show emotional immunity. They cannot use guilt as a leash when you are no longer tied to their approval. You are not just walking away from their control. You are forcing them to meet the person they actually are without the armor of your obedience. This confrontation creates an internal shame they do not know how to process. Instead of reflecting, they attack. Instead of growing, they blame. Instead of healing, they escalate. But the escalation is only proof that the mirror is working. The louder they become, the more exposed they feel. The more they lash out, the more their internal identity shakes. They project because introspection is unbearable. They punish because accountability feels like annihilation. They cling harder to illusion because the truth threatens the fragile ego they built, like a mask over emotional emptiness. And this is the secret thing most people never realize. Your fear was protecting them more than it was protecting you. Your fear covered their flaws. Your silence shielded their insecurity. Your emotional obedience hid their emptiness from exposure. Once fear dies, the shield drops, and they are forced to stand face to face with what they worked their entire life to escape themselves. When you finally remove fear from the equation, everything changes, not just between you and the narcissist, but within you, because the moment you stop trembling under their shadow, you realize you were never the weak one. You were simply manipulated into believing their voice was bigger than your own. The power you thought they possessed wasn't power. It was borrowed confidence sustained by your emotional surrender. Once you step back into your own strength, you don't just break their control. You reclaim the identity they tried to erase. The narcissist doesn't unravel because you attacked them. They unravel because you awakened. They don't react because you wounded them. They react because you stopped playing the role that kept their illusion alive. Without fear, they have nothing to stand on. Without fear, they can no longer write your story. Without fear, their throne crumbles beneath them, revealing there was never a king or queen sitting there at all. Just a frightened, hollow ego masquerading as authority. Your freedom is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is not explosive. Real freedom is silent, grounded, and unshakable. It shows up in the way you no longer explain yourself, no longer chase validation, no longer attach your worth to their approval. It shows up in the way you finally see them clearly and choose not to shrink. The collapse of their illusion is not your responsibility to fix. Their panic is not your burden to carry. Their insecurity is not your wound to heal. Your only task is to stand in the truth of who you are. Someone they could never break, only temporarily blind, because once fear leaves the room, so does their power, and what remains is you standing taller than the version of yourself they thought they controlled.